Water. As I've been working with our text for this week, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of water and the importance of a good water system. When my parents moved to Colorado over 25 years ago, I learned something about water and water rights that I didn't know. And that was that it was possible for someone to own a creek bed, but have no right to use or take the water that was running in that creek. And I also learned and was reminded again and again that when one area uses water, they sometimes have to take it from somewhere else. Of course, those of us who live in Waukesha, we know a little bit about water, don't we? As our population has grown and as we are taking up more and more water from the ground, the naturally occurring radon levels have become concentrated to the point where we now have to seek a new source of clean water. This past year, we've also watched the people of Flint, Michigan, as they've struggled to come up with a clean water source for washing and cooking and drinking because their system had gone a little downhill. And if we go further afield, we recognize the trouble that we have in Africa, where an ongoing drought is pushing people further and further to the brink of full-fledged famine. Water. It's a resource. And a few months ago, we were fortunate enough to experience the water service here at Southminster. That's when our friends from Heritage Presbyterian came and they led us in worship and thanksgiving to God for the resources that He has given to us. But they also reminded us that water is not precious only for our physical health, it is also essential for our spiritual health as well. Think about Genesis 1:2, where we read that the wind of God flowed over the waters of the deep. Water. It's elemental. It's basic. And I must admit that this realization brought me up short this week while I was reading the Old Testament text. You see, every time I read one of these murmuring stories or those grumbling stories, I have to think, wow, the Israelites are an ungrateful lot, aren't they? Think about it. God just rescued them from slavery in Egypt. And Moses, who was a stutterer, put himself in some pretty precarious and uncomfortable positions for their sake. And now they're grumbling about it? But then I had to think a little bit about where they were. They had crossed into the wilderness. And we know that in that part of the world, wilderness is desert. They were in the desert without water. Of course they would grumble. Of course they would talk to Moses because they were afraid. Because just as important as water, they also needed reassurance. Think about it. The life that they had in Egypt was difficult, incredibly difficult. They worked very, very hard in an unjust system. But it was predictable. They labored, but they had food, and they had water, and they had shelter. But then Moses came along and said that God had promised them a better land and a better life, and they just needed to follow him. And they believed Moses, and so they walked through the Red Sea, and they walked into the desert carrying only the things that they could put on their back. And now, although they had fled oppression, they found that they were still living in the life of hunger and thirst and death. They were afraid. No wonder they grumbled and got angry at Moses. They needed the reassurance that they hadn't just walked into a death trap. They needed God. And they needed the assurance of God's faithfulness. If we look around the United States today, despite some of the examples that I gave at the beginning of the sermon, we can say that we have a pretty secure water supply and a fairly secure food system. But we still hear a lot of grumbling. And as I've thought about this text, I've come to realize again that a lot of this grumbling comes out of fear. Because even though we have some of our basic necessities, we still have those very parched places in our lives where we fear for our very existence. Some people fear homelessness when they struggle each month to pay the rent. Some people fear that their children will go hungry if they have to make that decision between paying the heat bill or paying for food. Some people worry about a terrorist attack. Some people fear that their job will be sent to another place with a cheaper labor force, and they will be unable to make money and provide for their family. Some people wonder what is going to happen in retirement if they're not able to put enough aside, or if the government takes too big a chunk of their pay. Some fear that an addiction will overtake their life or that of their loved one. We have a reason to grumble and to be afraid. Lent is a time when many of us intentionally put ourselves in a state of need with fasting. In a way, we kind of enter a metaphorical desert in order to become closer to God. And as I told to the children, at this point in Lent, I bet some of us are kind of wondering, wow, I need a little sign that this is really worth it. For some people, life is kind of like a perpetual Lent. And they need a sign. They need something that says that God has not forgotten them. I have to wonder if the Samaritan woman who met Jesus at the well came to that well worried as well as thirsty. You see, in the course of her conversation with Jesus, we find out that she's had 5 husbands, and now she's with a man who's not her husband. Now, many commentators immediately point out that this is a sign of her sinfulness, and that Jesus is being gracious in offering her salvation. This may be true. There are some other situations or other turn of events that might have led to this situation. She might have been part of a Levirate marriage, and so like Tamar has been passed from one sibling to another. Maybe she's just had really bad luck. Maybe she's been too outspoken and has been divorced. But whatever the reason, you have to believe that her life was not easy. This was a woman who was living in a society in which a woman's only protection came from her marriage and her family. She could not go out and get a job. She could not sue for equal pay. And I have to believe that it was hard for her to walk around her village every day, day after day, and see the stares of people who knew about her situation, while she also wondered how she was going to survive. I believe that this woman was worried when she came to that well. Now, there are lots of things that I really love about this story. In fact, it's one of my favorites in the Bible. I love the fact that this woman, this worried woman, comes to the well and she actually engages in this long and really well-informed conversation with Jesus. And I love the fact that Jesus Christ once again throws the rule book out because he's walking in a place where Jews aren't welcome. And he's offering salvation to someone who's so very different from him. But most of all, I love the fact that Jesus meets this woman where she is. He is at her well, and he is thirsty. She comes to him, and what is the first thing Jesus says to her? "Woman, give me a drink." What does this say to us, if not, I understand you? Here is God, God, who is standing in front of this woman, he knows everything about her. And he says, I am thirsty. Give me a drink. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing that we have a God who shows up and meets us where we are, no matter who we are? And isn't it amazing that we have a God who knows hunger and who knows thirst and who knows that at the root of hunger and thirst and all those parched places is fear? And isn't it amazing that we have a God who not only offers living water, but also offers himself? We often talk about the fact that Jesus offered living water to this woman, but he also was there, right in front of him, right in front of her. And so she can see him, she can hear him, she could touch him if she had reached out. And she can go back to her village and say, come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? And the Samaritans in the village heard her testimony, and they came and they saw, and they heard, and they believed. Brothers and sisters, we have the promise that the living water that Jesus Christ offered to this woman is also offered to us. Because just like the woman at the well or the Israelites grumbling in the desert, we need water and we need God. But sometimes we also need that physical remembrance, that physical reminder of God's presence. How many of you have ever seen a baptism or remember your baptism? So maybe at your baptism you were dunked, or maybe you were sprinkled, or maybe someone poured water on you. But the thing is, you had that physical element bonded to the spiritual reality and promise. When we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we have the physical bread and the wine. And so we remember that we are fed physically and also in communion with our Lord, because in that way we know in our bodies as well as in our minds that we are saved and we are fed and we are cared for. And we know that Christ is there, and we know that God is faithful. But the thing is, God does not just show up in the bread and the wine and the water. Sometimes God also shows up in the work of other people. This semester I'm taking a course on leading short-term missions, and a couple weeks ago we were talking about the nature of witness. And I was struck by a quote by a woman who was helped after Hurricane Katrina. She had had a number of church groups come and help her with her house and in the neighborhood, and she had heard that the church groups weren't quite sure that they were doing enough. The job was too big. And she said, because those groups showed up, she remembered and she knew that God had not forgotten them. God had not forgotten them. Brothers and sisters, as you leave the sanctuary today, I hope you take a moment to dip your hand in the baptismal font. Don't worry, I've put clean water in there. So dip your hand in. Feel the physical presence of Christ. Know that you are baptized. But take that water out into the world. And remember, as you walk through your neighborhood, as you walk through your city, as you think about your state and your country and your world, that there are people who are grumbling because they need God to show up and reassure them that they are not forgotten. And maybe God is doing that through you. All praise, honor, and glory to you, O Christ.